In the Pacific at night, the ocean can look empty, just black water and a few distant stars. That emptiness is a lie. In 1942 and 1943, Allied lookouts would scan a calm horizon, see nothing, and then, without warning, feel the ship shudder as if it had struck a reef. Men describe the impact as a giant hammer hitting the hull below the waterline. Lights died, steam lines ruptured, compartments filled, and sometimes the first thing anyone saw was a second blast when fires reached fuel or ammunition deep inside the ship. The weapon behind many of those moments was not a battleship gun. It was a torpedo that acted like a long-range ambush, launched from beyond what Allied commanders believed was even possible. The Imperial Japanese Navy built it to win a very specific kind of fight. The night surface action, the sudden collision of formations where one side could strike first, vanish into darkness, and strike again before dawn. The Japanese called it the Type 93. The Allies later nicknamed it Long Lance because it reached farther than their mental map of torpedoes allowed. It was huge, 610 millimeters, 24 inches, in diameter and roughly 9 meters long. And it carried a warhead heavy enough to tear open a cruiser's vitals. But the surprise was not only size. The real shock was how it moved through the sea. Most torpedoes of the era betrayed themselves with a frothing bubble trail. The Type 93 used a pure oxygen propulsion system that could reduce visible wake compared with typical compressed air designs. And it paired that with performance that seemed impossible to crews who were judging the threat by their own torpedo limits. That oxygen decision sounds simple when you say it fast. It was not. Pure oxygen is both gift and hazard. It lets a torpedo engine burn fuel efficiently without dragging inert nitrogen along for the ride. That means more energy, more range, and less exhaust gas. Exactly the combination you want if your doctrine is shoot first, unseen. But it also means you are handling an oxidizer that can turn small mistakes into catastrophes. Leaks, contamination, or careless maintenance could be fatal long before any enemy appeared. The Type 93 was not just a weapon, it was an industrial and training commitment. Special handling, strict procedures, and crews who treated torpedo work like explosives work, not like routine mechanics. Japan still took the gamble because interwar thinking pushed them there. Their fleet planners expected a future war against an opponent with deeper industrial capacity. They did not want a long, balanced exchange of ships. They wanted an early sequence of lopsided blows that could reduce enemy strength before the decisive battle line ever formed. Night torpedo attacks were the attrition weapon in that plan. Destroyers and cruisers thinning an enemy fleet while staying outside the heaviest gunfire. To make that work, you need more than a torpedo. You need a system. First, you need ships built and trained to fire accurately at night. Japanese destroyers and cruisers carried multiple tube banks and drilled for coordinated attacks, spreads, staggered launches, and disciplined timing so multiple torpedoes arrive together, saturating evasive maneuvers. Second, you need reconnaissance and timing, float planes, scouts, and formation handling so the attacking force can approach, launch, and withdraw before the target fully understands what is happening. Third, you need an assumption baked into training that one well-placed underwater hit is not just damage. It is tempo control. It slows, turns, and disrupts a formation, creating chaos that gunnery can exploit, or allowing the attackers to slip away while the enemy fights fires in the dark. The Type 93 sat at the center because it stretched the geometry of the night battle. Later technical discussions emphasized its danger as a three-part combination: long reach, high speed, and a large warhead. That combination broke Allied expectations. Early U.S. and Commonwealth commanders tended to think in terms of their own torpedoes: shorter legs, shorter danger zones. If you believe enemy torpedoes cannot reach beyond a certain distance, you will accept a position that seems safe. You will worry about shells, not underwater hits. You will hold your course longer. You will not zigzag as aggressively because you are saving maneuver for gunfire accuracy. And if you see muzzle flashes, you will aim your attention at the ships firing the guns, while the torpedoes launched minutes earlier are already running toward you through the darkness. This mismatch between belief and reality is why long lands often felt supernatural in Allied reports. It seemed to appear from nowhere, but it did not come from nowhere. It came from doctrine that treated torpedoes as the first punch, and from a weapon that could travel far enough to make that first punch land before the target knew to defend. The night of August 8th to 9th, 1942 at Savo Island is a harsh example of how the system worked when everything aligned. A Japanese force under Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa slipped into position and attacked Allied cruisers guarding the waters near Guadalcanal. Flares and gunfire turned silhouettes into targets. Torpedoes hit below the armor belt, where ships were most vulnerable. In a short, brutal window, multiple Allied cruisers were wrecked or sinking, and the Japanese force withdrew before daylight could trap it. For the Allies, the immediate lesson was painful and incomplete. They understood they had been outfought at night. They did not fully understand why torpedoes seemed to arrive from impossible distances, or why the bubble trails they expected were absent, faint, or noticed too late. Even when fragments were recovered and damage examined, it took time for intelligence and doctrine to accept the scale of the threat. Contemporary summaries note the Type 93's unusual propulsion and reach were not quickly understood in 1942, and that delay mattered. Guadalcanal did not end at Savo Island. It turned into a grinding series of night clashes, destroyers racing in, cruisers trading fire at close range, ships dodging shells while unseen torpedoes ran beneath them. Each battle became a laboratory of fear and adaptation. Japan kept trying to win with the night system they had built. The Allies kept trying to survive long enough to bring radar, air power, and daylight control into play. In the next stretch of this story, we follow one question that haunted Allied officers after each night battle. How do you fight an enemy whose most dangerous weapon is not the ship you can see, but the invisible path it has already launched into the sea? The most dangerous part of a long lance attack was not the explosion. It was the minutes before it, when your ship was still behaving like a ship on a normal watch. The horizon looked calm. The formation held steady. Officers thought about gunnery arcs, not underwater lanes. And then, without warning, the sea itself seemed to punch upward. To understand why this kept happening, you have to understand how night combat thinking worked in the early Pacific War. Most navies imagined torpedoes as close-range weapons, short legs, visible wakes, and a danger zone you could step outside of by keeping distance. That assumption shaped everything: where you placed your cruisers, how aggressively you turned, how long you held a steady course to keep your own guns accurate. Japan's Type 93 rewrote that geometry. It did not simply extend range. It extended the time an enemy could be already dead without knowing it. A Japanese destroyer could launch from farther out, turn away, and still have torpedoes running toward you while you were focused on gun flashes and silhouettes. That time gap created an illusion. You thought the threat was still approaching, when in reality the threat had already left your ship and was gliding underwater. Now add the second layer, discipline. Long lance attacks were rarely a single torpedo fired like a duel. They were spreads. Multiple ships could launch, sometimes in coordinated timing, so the ocean became a fan of crossing paths. Even if one torpedo missed, the next might meet you in the turn you made to evade the first. In the dark, evasion could become self-trap. For Allied crews, the wake problem was psychological and practical. Many expected to see the frothing line of bubbles that typical compressed air torpedoes produced. When they didn't see it, they felt blind. Sometimes there was a wake, but it was faint, broken, or simply lost in night sea texture. White caps, flare reflections, smoke shadows. By the time the wake was noticed, the only option was violent maneuver. And violent maneuver is exactly what ruins gunnery accuracy, breaks formation spacing, and creates collisions in darkness. A night battle also punishes human attention. If flares go up, everyone looks at what is lit. If gunfire flashes, everyone looks at the ship firing. If a cruiser takes a shell hit, everyone looks at the burning deck and the men running. The torpedo, meanwhile, is patient. It does not need the spotlight. It only needs the lane you keep giving it by staying steady. This is why long lance victories often look like sudden disasters in Allied memory. They were not sudden to the attackers. They were scheduled. The torpedoes were launched first, sometimes while the guns were still quiet, because the Japanese doctrine treated the torpedo as the opening sentence of the battle. The guns were the punctuation, the enemy's confusion was the conclusion, and yet the long lance system had its own limits. Limits that matter because they explain how the Allies eventually learned to survive it. First, a torpedo is only as good as the targeting solution. At night, range estimation and bearing accuracy become everything. Misjudge speed or course, and your torpedoes run harmlessly into black water. Japanese crews worked hard to reduce this risk, using night optics, trained lookouts, and doctrine that emphasized getting into position before firing. But even with skill, the ocean is not a map. Smoke screens, rain squalls, and broken visibility could disrupt the perfect approach. Second, long-range torpedoes create long-range commitment. Once launched, you cannot call them back. If the enemy turns unexpectedly, if friendly ships drift into the lane, if the battle geometry changes, your own weapons can become hazards. This was rare in disciplined attacks, but it was always a risk in chaotic night water. Third, the oxygen system demanded careful handling and maintenance. The same chemistry that gave the long lance its terrifying reach was not forgiving. Torpedoes were loaded and serviced by men who understood that a mistake could burn their own ship. This is part of why Japan's torpedo arm looked like a craft. It was not just equipment. It was a culture of procedure. The Allies did not defeat long lance by wishing it away. They defeated it by changing what night meant. The biggest shift was radar, especially surface search radar that could detect ships beyond the range of eyesight and beyond the tricks of flare light. Radar changed the timeline. If you can see an approaching formation earlier, you can maneuver earlier. You can deny the attacker the perfect launch position. You can force them to fire from a bad angle or at a bad moment. Even a great torpedo cannot fix a bad geometry. The second shift was doctrine. Treat torpedoes as long-range threats even when you think you are safe. That means you do not gift the enemy long, steady courses. It means you respect unseen lanes. It means you stop assuming that distance equals safety. And it means you begin to think like the torpedo does. Not where is the enemy ship now, but where will their torpedoes be in 4 minutes if they launched already? The third shift was the hard, unglamorous work of formation control. Night maneuver is dangerous, but disciplined maneuver is survivable. Allied forces improved at maintaining spacing, at making coordinated turns, at reducing collisions, and at keeping guns and torpedo watch functioning under stress. This was not a single invention. It was learning paid for in wrecked steel. Still, even as the Allies adapted, the long lance remained a fear weapon. It punished complacency. It punished straight lines. It punished the belief that night was simply daylight with less light. In the Pacific, night was a different war. And the most chilling detail is this. Many crews who were hit never saw the attacker. They saw only the consequence, an underwater explosion that arrived like fate. In the next segment, we step into the exact moment the Allies began to turn the tables. When radar, discipline, and timing started to break Japan's night advantage, forcing the long lance from invisible certainty into risky gamble. The first time the long lance started losing its invisibility, the ocean did not change. The ships did not magically grow armor. What changed was the timeline of awareness. The Allies began to see the night earlier than their eyes could. Early in the Pacific War, night combat was still treated like a visual problem. If you could not see the enemy, you could not aim. And if you could not aim, you could not control the fight. Japan built its advantage around that assumption. They trained for darkness, practiced approach discipline, and trusted the Type 93 torpedo to land the first blow before the enemy even understood the distance was dangerous. Radar turned that assumption into a trap. At first it was crude and uneven. Sets were temperamental. Operators were learning in real time. Contacts were confusing. Land clutter, squalls, sea returns, false echoes. But even imperfect radar did one revolutionary thing. It gave a commander permission to maneuver before gunfire, before flares, before fear took over. It gave the Allies a way to deny Japan the perfect launch geometry. Because the long lance was not a magic spear, it was a physics weapon. It required bearing accuracy and timing. It required the attacker to approach into an ideal angle, launch, and then let the torpedoes run into a predictable lane. If the lane moved, if the target changed course earlier than expected, the torpedoes could pass behind or fan into empty water. And once a spread was wasted, the attacker had spent the best surprise they had. This is where Allied doctrine began to harden. Treat every night like torpedoes are already in the water. That sounds paranoid. It saved ships. It changed how formations held course. It changed how long a ship stayed steady to shoot. It changed when destroyers were pushed forward and when cruisers held back. It also changed how commanders valued information. A radar contact was not just a dot. It was a warning that somewhere out there was a ship built to launch a weapon you might never see. The next step was organization. Radar by itself does not win. It informs. The Allies learned to build a rhythm around it. Detect, classify, maneuver, then strike on their own terms. Combat information centers, Dark compartments where plots and bearings were turned into decisions became the brain of the ship at night. Instead of everyone staring into black water, a small team could focus on bearing changes, range closures, and intercept angles, feeding the bridge a calmer picture of the fight. Calm matters at night. Panic creates straight lines. Straight lines invite torpedoes. But Japan did not stand still while this shift happened. The Imperial Japanese Navy also used lookouts, optics, discipline formations, and aggressive night leadership. They still had long lance. They still had practiced attack methods. And in the early phase, they still had confidence. Many Japanese commanders believed that even if the enemy had radar, the decisive moment would still be the torpedo spread, the underwater decision that did not care what your eyes could see. So the night war became a race between two clocks. Japan's clock was a torpedo runtime, launch, run, impact. The Allies' clock became the radar timeline. Detect early enough to spoil the launch and force the enemy to fire from a worse position or at a worse moment or not at all. When that race tightened, the long lance became less like an execution and more like a gamble. A gamble is still deadly, but it changes behavior. A Japanese destroyer commander who is not sure of the enemy's course has to choose between waiting for a better solution, which risks being detected and engaged first, or launching earlier with lower certainty. The first choice risks shells. The second risks wasting torpedoes. And once torpedoes are gone, a destroyer is suddenly just a small ship in a night fight, relying on guns and speed against opponents who may now know where it is. This is where Allied improvements began to stack. Better radar handling meant fewer false contacts and faster classification. Better gunnery solutions meant first salvos landed sooner once contact was confirmed. Better formation discipline meant fewer collisions and fewer ships masking one another's fire. And better communication within a task group and within a ship meant fewer moments of confusion when seconds mattered. Meanwhile, Japan's night advantage carried its own hidden costs. The Long Lance's oxygen system demanded careful handling. Torpedo tubes and reloads took time. The best attacks required coordination, and coordination is harder when the enemy can detect you earlier and start shooting sooner. Even when a Japanese force launched successfully, the window to withdraw cleanly narrowed because radar-guided opponents could keep contact longer into the darkness. The sea stopped being a curtain. It became a screen that could glow with information. Still, the Long Lance remained terrifying because it punished one mistake brutally. A single straight course held too long. A single turn made too late. A single formation that bunched up and became predictable. The torpedo did not need many hits to change a battle. One underwater hit could slow a cruiser, break its steering, knock out power, and turn a disciplined formation into a rescue problem in the dark. That is why the Long Lance story is not simply Japan had a great torpedo and then radar ended it. The true story is sharper. The Allies survived by learning to fight like engineers. They treated the night battle as a system problem. They improved detection, improved processing, improved procedure, and improved discipline. They did not remove danger, they reduced it. And once danger was reduced, industrial weight could do the rest. More ships, more training cycles, more radar sets, more experienced crews rotating through combat. Japan's Long Lance was still a masterpiece of night lethality. But masterpieces can be outgrown when the enemy rewrites the rules around them. In the next segment, we reach the emotional center of this weapon. The moment a torpedo attack succeeds anyway, because even a solved threat is still deadly, and what that reveals about fear, confidence, and the thin line between control and chaos on a black Pacific Sea. Even after radar began to cut into Japan's night advantage, the long lance did not become harmless, it became selective. It stopped being a guaranteed opening sentence and became a weapon that punished the exact moments when fear, confusion, and habit still ruled Allied behavior. Because a torpedo does not care how modern your ship is, it cares how predictable your ship is. In the Black Pacific, that predictability often appeared during transitions, when a force had just made contact and was still organizing, when ships were changing formation, when a commander held course to steady gunnery, when smoke, rain, or glare disrupted radar returns, when a wounded ship slowed and forced others to maneuver around it. In those moments, the ocean offered the long lance a lane again. Japanese destroyer and cruiser commanders learned to hunt for that lane. If they could not approach unseen for the perfect spread, they tried to create confusion and then fire into it. If radar forced them away from an ideal angle, they launched at the moment they believed the enemy's course would stay steady when Allied ships were focused on guns, on signals, on not colliding, on not losing track. The weapon's power became psychological. It made every decision feel like a choice between two dangers: hold steady and risk torpedoes, turn and lose accuracy, spacing, and control. That pressure, tempo pressure, was the long lance at its most honest. Allied adaptation by the later war years came down to a handful of habits repeated until they became instinct. First, assume torpedoes are already in the water, not because you have proof, but because the penalty for being wrong is smaller than the penalty for being surprised. That meant earlier course changes, wider formation spacing, and a refusal to gift long, steady lanes at the exact time the enemy wanted them most. Second, keep the brain working when the eyes fail. Combat information centers became more than equipment rooms, they became discipline rooms. Bearings were checked, contact tracks were updated, speed estimates were argued, and decisions were made with a colder kind of logic. A night battle is chaos. CIC was the mechanism that made chaos less expensive. Third, deny the attacker the clean exit. One reason early Japanese night attacks felt supernatural was that the attackers often withdrew before daylight and before pursuit could settle. As Allied radar and coordination improved, keeping contact longer became possible. A destroyer that launched and tried to vanish could be tracked, chased, and punished. The night stopped being a hiding place and became a hunting ground for both sides. But for Japan, the long lance remained a brutal piece of engineering logic. It was built for a doctrine that valued first strike, confusion, and withdrawal. It carried that doctrine inside its metal body, and even when the war's balance shifted, the torpedo's presence forced a certain respect. It forced Allied commanders to think not only in terms of visible ships, but in terms of invisible trajectories, delayed consequences, and the cost of complacency. That is the weapon's deeper story. It changed how men imagined the sea. The ocean became a place where the most lethal threat might already be moving long before anyone could point at it. It became a place where distance did not equal safety and darkness did not equal ignorance. It became a place where the enemy's best shot could be taken without a single muzzle flash. And that is why the long lance deserves its reputation. Not because it was magic, because it was a rare convergence of design, training, and doctrine that matched their environment perfectly. A torpedo with long reach, a navy drilled to use it, and a theater filled with night battles where minutes of surprise could decide lives. Yet there is also the moral edge that sits under every perfect weapon story. A perfect weapon invites perfect confidence. Confidence encourages risk. Risk demands luck. And war eventually runs out of luck. Japan built a night system meant to shorten a long war, but the Pacific became a long war anyway. As the Allies learned, as radar spread, as crews gained experience, as production multiplied ships and sensors, the Long Lance's terror could no longer decide the whole campaign by itself. It could still kill. It could still break ships. But it could not stop the larger momentum once the enemy learned the pattern and brought more tools to the fight. In the end, the Long Lance stands as a reminder that engineering can create momentary dominance, but dominance is always temporary when the other side adapts. It also reminds us of something quieter. The men who fought these night actions were not fighting only steel and fire. They were fighting uncertainty. They were fighting the fear of an invisible path under the water, the fear that you could do everything right and still be hit, because someone else solved the geometry first. So when you hear stories of ships sinking before they saw it, understand what that really means. It means the battle was decided earlier, by design decisions in factories, by training decisions on decks, by doctrine decisions in classrooms, and by small choices made on bridges in darkness. Thank you for watching. If you want more World War II stories like this, focused on tactics, engineering, and the human pressure inside the machines, subscribe and check the description for the next full video.